of the righteousness of the faith which he had, yet being uncircumcised. Now, in Romans 4:13, I think it's a little bit clearer. For the promise that he should be the heir of the world was not to Abraham or to his seed through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. Now see, we just turned it around. I don't know if you noticed it or not, but it is the same thing, the righteousness of the faith that he had. It's a seal of the righteousness of the faith that he had. Here it is, but through the righteousness of faith. Now I don't know if we're all the same here this morning when you read that, but I have a difficulty just simply having the word "the" in there that I don't have over here. It's easier for me to see that Abraham is the heir of the world. He received this sign, and it was, or this seal, and it was a result of the righteousness of faith. So that tells me that there is a righteousness that takes place because you believe. Now, is that really that difficult when you basically get down to it like that? He is the Father of all them that believe. And when a person believes, like Abraham, you end up being righteous. Well, how are you righteous? Well, this verse actually says that this righteousness might be imputed to them also. Well, what is that telling us? That when God sees a certain level of faith, he then imputes to you, he imputes to your account the statement that you're righteous, or the state of affairs that you're righteous. Now, I want you to stop this morning and ask yourself this question. Are you really righteous? Is anybody really right in all that they do? How does a person become righteous? Well, our neighbors basically say, our religious neighbors out there, they say that when you just simply believe that Jesus is the Son of God, God imputes to you Jesus' righteousness. Is that really what's being taught here? Is that really what Abraham did? The faith that Abraham had. Let's think about this. Does that sound like the belief that Abraham had? Does it just sound like that Abraham just said, I believe that you're God? It seems like to me, y'all, I remember that Abraham, on one occasion in Genesis 22, climbed a mountain, went up with his son Isaac, and he, in fact, was obedient to the point that he was going to, and in his mind, actually went through the process of offering his son. Now, does that sound like the idea of a person just hears a sermon and it's so well crafted and it's emotional in its being, and the presentation is such that, or a story is such that you get emotional and all of a sudden you just say, I want to go up and say, I believe Jesus. And at that point, God imputes to you Jesus' righteousness. You know, that makes what we're doing, that makes what we're involved in so trivial. Does it not? Is that not trivial? I mean, that is just ridiculous. There was a guy down here at Figsboro. He used to go out and he would knock doors, and if he could get you to say, I believe Jesus is the Son of God, he would say to his congregation that he had saved people. And on one occasion he had out there on his marquee that they had saved 120-something people that week. Seriously? That is so profane, isn't it? That is what we're looking at here this morning? Well, for us to know it's not doesn't mean that we know what it is, though, does it? Okay, we all agree it's more than that. It must contain more than that. But what is it? Do you really know what it is? You know, I'm convinced this morning that if we don't know what it is, there'll be two things that happen. You won't be saved, and you'll be miserable. Wouldn't you think? If a person doesn't understand the righteousness that is of faith, chances are you're working your way to heaven. You know, I had such a peaceful moment last week. And the reason I'm telling you this is because I'm going to tell you my inner workings, how difficult this is. And I think I told maybe you all on Wednesday that I had actually gotten a free psychological session with Omar's wife, Megan. And she texted me after about a month or 3 or 4 weeks. I was kind of worried after 3 weeks. I hadn't heard from her after I talked to her as a psychologist. And she said, I've been busy. And I was thinking, boy, I'm glad. I was kind of worried about the fact that you hadn't talked to me in 3 weeks after I talked to you. And she told me that she had seen what Mike and Caleb and I had been up to in regard to the Texas trip and a couple of other things. And she said, Johnny, you need to rest. You have earned it. And I told her, I don't remember the last time somebody told me those 3 words. Now, people tell me you're doing a great job and we appreciate you and things like that, but that was such a peaceful moment. Now, she's not God in any sense, but I expect that she really, a psychologist, clinical psychologist, she sees a lot of people and she hears a lot of stuff. And I don't think she just throws out, you've earned it. She's a Christian. I don't think she throws that out very often. But it was so nice. And I wondered about that. Why? Why was that? Why was I so eager to hear that? Why was that so peaceful? Why was that such a nice thing? And I just thought, what could I do for Megan? You see what we're saying? If we don't get this, it is likely that we might actually be struggling right here. It might be that our Christian life is a burden. And I know in one sense, y'all, on the one hand, we have to realize that it is going to be a burden. Isn't that the thing about Christianity, the paradox? We've looked at before Paul saying, I rejoice always, and then in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, 7 and 9, he says, I despaired even of life. How can you rejoice always in despair of life? Well, on the one hand, you recognize that you're saved and that upon leaving, and especially if you're under threat of death, you know that upon leaving, you know where you're headed. You know what's next. But at the same time, you despair because of all the responsibilities and the situations you find yourself in. That is a paradox. And so on the one hand, it is the case that there is a burden. Everybody we know is lost, aren't they? Everybody we know is lost, pretty much. And so we also know that if we're associated with them, we've got some responsibility. So therein is a burden. It weighs upon us. And so if we don't find the happy ground, I think that we may be just waiting really a matter of time, and we might fall away. Look around us. How many people have fallen away? Why do they fall away? When you think about falling away, what in the world do you fall away to? Everybody knows that when you fall away to darkness. Do you think people just simply one day say, you know what? I just love darkness. Man, I love darkness. I think I'll just get out there and I won't even have a night light, a flashlight, or one of those security lights. My house is going to be the darkest place on the planet at night. No, nobody does that, do they? But yet people do it. And so what does that tell you? They're not thinking. But the problem that we're trying to get to is, why would anybody do that? Why might we do it? Why might we consider it? Have we considered it? And if we have, or if we do, it's right here. The righteousness, but through the righteousness of faith. It is likely this morning that individuals don't understand how that God can pronounce that you're righteous. And you know what you just said if you said that? We just said we don't understand how faith works. Well, is that so terrible? It is in one sense, but everybody around us doesn't either. So it is something that we certainly need to look at. Look at this. Look at how this works. As you think about yourself, Romans 4:20. He staggered not Well, right there we put this whole thing in perspective, didn't we? I have talked to nearly everybody in this congregation. I'm looking around at you, and I don't really want to put any pressure on anybody, but probably the only person that I have not had a heart-to-heart or a time of discussion about something in your life is Jackie. I just haven't gotten to know Jackie that well yet. But everybody else that I'm looking at, I've had a talk with you about some struggle, exception of Melanie. Take that back. And I know that we all struggle. And Anson, I'll take it back. Let's just go ahead and get it right. I don't know, Anson. I've talked to you before about some things. He staggered not at the promise of God through unbelief, but was strong in faith, giving glory to God. Now I want you to think about this. Is it the case that you know the Bible well enough to know that Abraham isn't able to say that he never staggered? Do you know Abraham well enough to know that that's not what that verse is saying? He staggered not at the promises of God through unbelief, but was strong in faith, giving glory to God. Y'all, what this is saying is that in the overall picture of Abraham's life, do not think that Abraham never staggered. But in the overall picture, when God looks at Abraham's life, Abraham always came out faithful. Okay? Now, does that help? I know you're staggering. I know stuff that's going on right now with individuals in this congregation. I know some things that are going on with me right now. It is difficult, but the thing that we're reading about Abraham is that Abraham held it together. He was able to continue on being strong in faith, giving glory to God. Now, what does that simply mean? Strong in faith. It means as these events came up, as he struggled through them, as he dealt with them, as he had his weak moments, as he had his situations, at the end of it, Abraham believed God enough that Abraham would somehow or other change the direction of his life, somehow or other change the events that he was involved in, and Abraham would put God into the mix. Now, does that not make it a little bit easier than saying, well, we've got the law of Moses, 613 commandments, and I kept every one of them? Nope, not going to happen. Well, how many commandments are there in the New Testament? I knew a preacher that told me when he was in his 60s that he had never missed a single assembly. Not one. He had his gallbladder removed, and he didn't miss an assembly. Now, you know what he was trying to tell me? Man, I am faithful. But you know what? I knew him for about 7 years, and he didn't knock doors in the community. When John Shannon came and did a tent meeting, he left town on his vacation. Now, you can attend all the services you want to, but if you don't love souls and you're not involved in what Jesus was involved in, see, he's not being faithful. But he thinks he's being faithful because he's keeping up with a set of actions that he can write down and he can look back on. That's not what Abraham did. Y'all, Abraham was able to keep his faith in God so that regardless of what happened at the end of it, it ends up being stated that he believed God and he stayed the course. And being fully persuaded that what he had promised, he was able to also to perform. You know what, brethren? Clark, I really appreciate the prayer that you pray when you're praying, when you're leading us in prayer for the free will offering in our giving. Clark prays that God would help us to give a great portion back to God. Look at this. Are you fully persuaded about God's promises? Do you know one of the places where you find that out? Each Lord's Day, this is not a lesson on giving. Each Lord's Day, you demonstrate how much you trust God. Do you not realize that the giving is in fact designed to build your faith? God don't need your money. Don't we realize God doesn't need our money, really? And we could change this thing around, and we could actually almost make it by meeting in someone's home. We could almost change it to the point where we didn't hardly have any expenses. And then what will we do? This is an exercise in God's own mind. He put it together. It's an exercise to see who you trust more. George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, you get me? Andrew Jackson. Who do you trust the most? Each and every time we give, we are actually mentally, psychologically going through a procedure that it verifies in our mind. If you're not a giver, I can tell you right now, you don't trust God. That's just it. I didn't say that. This is what the Bible says. If you have trouble at the plate, you're going to have trouble at the gate. Mark it down. God loves a cheerful giver. You know why? Because if you can give cheerfully, turn around and give money that God doesn't need in the first place, that you feel like you probably need, but because you love God and you don't stagger at God's promises that He can take care of you without that money that you just gave up, and you're cheerful about it, you know what God knows? He knows you have faith. See, that's how it works. These are times, there are events in our life where God actually gets to see our faith. Now see, that's why the Baptists, they miss it from the very get-go. And that's why their preachers have to beat up on them about giving all the time. I mean, every week on television, you hear them talking about giving. You know why they do that? Because they miss it at the very beginning. They don't have the faith that God can operate on them in the place where God says that He will operate on you. We're baptized, Colossians 2:12 says, wherein also we're risen with Him through the faith in the operation of God who raised Him from the dead. God can raise us from the dead, put us in a new position with His Son, where sin can't touch us, can't stick to us like Teflon. You heard of the Teflon Don? Can't stick to us. We're always in a position where we can stay right. And God has fixed that in the very beginning by obeying the gospel. And everybody misses it but y'all. We all see that's where it begins, and we're willing to go through that, and we're willing to allow our family to know that we did that. Verse 22, therefore it was imputed to him for righteousness. If a person basically is just, if you're willing to say, now, I'm going to tell you this morning, you're going to have to study Abraham. That's just all there is to it. You're going to have to really become acquainted with Abraham. But now it was written, now it was not written for his sake alone that it was imputed to him. Well, what was it, Paul? But for us also, to whom it shall be imputed if we believe on Him that raised up Jesus from the dead. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean we just have to believe that God raised Him up from the dead one time? That's what the Baptists say. No, that's not it. That is not it. We believe that God raised Him from the dead, which basically means that if death couldn't hurt Jesus, if death couldn't stop God, then what in the world can stop us? That's what that's really talking about. And that's why the apostles went forth from sniveling, shivering, fearful individuals who were hiding behind women in Luke chapter 24 to the front streets of Jerusalem in the face of all of the opposition that killed Jesus, and then stood right up and called their name out and said, "You killed the Messiah." That's what that means, is individuals realize that God has the power. And beyond this life, after this life, it's okay. Now, let's notice a couple of staggerings. Now watch this. When we talk about law keeping, y'all, Galatians 3:21, is the law then against the promises of God? God forbid. This all has a context, but I just want to get this one part. If there had been a law given which could have given life, verily righteousness should have been by the law. That preacher keeping up with the fact that he had been to services every single time the doors open for 50-something years, that's not going to save him. There is no such thing as keeping a tab and going to heaven. There is no law that can get you to heaven. The only thing that can get us to heaven is for us to have faith, strong belief, so that we don't stagger. Now, when we say don't stagger, let me prove this. Abraham did stagger in an isolated way. You have any isolated staggering that's going on? Don't beat yourself up over that. In Genesis 15:1, after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abraham in a vision, saying, "Fear not, Abraham." You know what Abraham had just done? Abraham had just delivered Lot. Boy, that was tough, y'all. He went and got Lot from all of those kings, using only his 318 household servants, and he went all the way to Damascus, and he got Lot back, defeated all those kings. And don't you know that worried him? Does it worry you sometimes when you aggravate and agitate somebody? We told last week on Wednesday that Annette Hinton is certainly worried. She's got folk over there at the hospital so aggravated that they're doing her just like they did Mark McMinnis. They're going to human resources. And they came down the other day and they weren't wanting to know how is Annette doing her job and all that. They just want to know, where is Annette Hinton and what is the stuff she's handing out? It gets scary, doesn't it? Just because you get scared. And I don't know what Annette's doing right now. I don't know if she's backed up, if she's pulled in. I don't know. But I just know that if she continues to keep her faith, it doesn't mean that she's got to take down the hospital, does it? But it basically means that she can't say, okay, this is what happens when I do what God says, when I try to stand up for the truth and I get backlash. It means that you have to make sure that you don't stagger. What are we saying here? Let's look. Genesis 20:11. And Abraham said, because I thought surely the fear of God is not in this place, and they will slay me for my wife's sake. You recognize that passage? That's how Abraham felt when he was traveling around outside of Canaan. He was so fearful. Now this is 20, that was 15. Fear not, I am thy shield. He was so fearful that God wasn't in that place that he told Sarah, tell them you're my sister. And then on this particular instance, Abimelech was going to take Sarah into his harem. And what did God do? He had a dream in the middle of the night. You better not touch my prophet. And that's where the passage, do my prophet no harm. Touch not my anointed. That's where that comes from. All these, just go ahead and say, foolish folk who use this out of context have no idea what took place. But look at Abraham. Y'all, is Abraham afraid? I mean, is this realistic? Sometimes we make these people into superhumans. They're not superhumans. They're just like us. An individual who feared for his life because his wife was beautiful. What do you fear for? Sometimes it's our property. I've got people coming all over my property, Eugene. And I sometimes go through scenarios and I just wonder, man, is this property really worth it? I have just a vivid imagination when it comes to folk on my property. And what will happen next if I do this and I do that? And sometimes Lori tells me, well, say something. Well, one day I did say something. And she said, what in the world did you do that for? Well, that's what happens when you say something. You know, men talking to men, next thing you know, you might get slapped across the face. Is it worth it? Property? You see, this is the kind of things that we're talking about. We're trying to be righteous in a world that's filled with wicked individuals. And don't let your imagination or don't let the devil tell you that Abraham never had trouble, because he did. But the thing is Abraham believed God would take him through, and he kept pushing God. He kept doing what it was that God wanted to do. Sure, he had these times of difficulty. Sure, he had situations where he had failings and made mistakes, but at the end of the day, he didn't stagger. You see, that's the point. Be faithful, Revelation 14:13 is saying, be faithful unto death. And that's why I'm telling Caleb in his class, make me want to suffer. Here's an account, Esther 4:11. I don't have to spend time on this, y'all, because I know that you know this. Queen Esther was in a situation where she was the only one that could do something. And when she found out that it was up to her, when Mordecai came in and said, all the Jews are going to be killed, and Esther, it's up to you, look what she said. All the king's servants and all the people know that in the king's province, do know that whosoever, whether man or woman, shall come into the king in the inner court, who is not called there, is one law. Who is not called there is one law of his to put him to death, except such to whom the king shall hold out his golden scepter, that he may live. Listen, I have not been called to come into the king these 30 days. You want me? You want everything depends on me? Here's where the metal hits the road, y'all. The rubber hits the road. There are going to be times when God is dependent on you. And you only. Only you can accomplish this. You know, can you imagine being Esther? Can you imagine being this one woman, this one girl? Do you know how many families have been saved by a girl, a woman? You know, isn't it amazing that when we think about women's lib and all this garbage that goes around, and people basically say that, and about us, that we diminish women. Women generally have a spiritual side. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's because you all are more fragile and that you actually think about needing God more than maybe men do, because you know men sometimes think that they rule the world. But it seems that women often are the ones who are thinking about the spiritual things. How many times has it been the case that a girl made the difference? You may be thinking about your life this morning. It could be the case that you, as a girl or as a woman, will actually make the difference in your entire family. I know that 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 14 actually says that a woman can sanctify her entire household. She can be married to the wildest, craziest idiot that you can imagine. And because a woman is willing to be faithful, doesn't mean she can always make every decision and control every event, but she's willing to be faithful and she's willing to press for truth and righteousness. And when it's time for her to do what has to be done, must be done, she goes ahead and does it. And you know the Bible says that she can sanctify her children and her house. In other words, what that means is there's a whole lot of ignorant stuff that will never happen because you are faithful. Your children will never have to go through certain things because you're faithful. You just think about a woman who won't let her husband drink at home. And when somebody might say, well, I was her husband, she couldn't stop me. Man, women can really, they have a lot of control when you really get down to it. You can put your foot down and make it so miserable for a man. And just think about this. Just think about all of the events and episodes that your children will never have to go through, never see, because you said, as long as I'm in this house, you're not drinking here. Now somebody says, I just don't believe a woman can do that. Well, you go around town and look and see how many men are outside smoking. You following me? You ever go out around town, you ever see a man standing out in the cold snow smoking? You know why he's out there smoking? Because his wife won't let him smoke in the house. Wives do that kind of thing. On trivial things, they end up having their way. But see, when we're talking about things like this, women and girls have so much power. Can you imagine this morning? What if it is the case that your entire family is watching to see what you do? Can it be like that? Absolutely, it can be like that. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about a person having faith. Jeremiah chapter 18, verse 19, here's a king, and Jeremiah was telling him, look, if you'll just give in, I'm not going to read this, you can see it. If you'll give up, your wives will be spared, and your children will be spared. And he ends up saying, I'm afraid. I'm afraid. Wasn't Abraham afraid? Abraham was afraid, but at the end of the day, Abraham basically ended up saying, look, I believe God more than I believe my fear or whatever it is they're going to do to me. I believe God more. See, that's what we're talking about at the end of the day. We're not talking about every little thing that you did or did not do. Because even when you make up your mind with all your strength that I'm never going to do blank again, you know what? Chances are you're going to do blank again. We're not talking about that. We're talking about, is it the case that when God looks down, He sees you and God is first and you're being faithful. You're trying to do what God says to do. And times when you're weak and things get ahead of God, you then start chipping away to try to move it back to the way it should be, and God's watching. You're faithful. Now listen to the other part of that. You're faithful, and He imputes that as righteousness. It's not a life of perfection. It's a life of constantly trying to get back where you belong, and God's watching, and at the end of the day, He says, she's faithful. He's faithful. And right along with He's faithful, she's faithful, comes the term, He's righteous, she's righteous. Folks, that's how we live this life. And there are going to be instances where we're going to be tried. Acts 23:16. I want you to think about this. I wish we had more young people to talk to, but I don't know exactly how old Paul's sister's son was. But can you imagine being this young man? He had heard that 40 people were going to kill Paul. Can you imagine in that climate, there are 40 Jews that have said, we're not going to eat or drink until we kill Paul? You're in occupied territory. The Romans are controlling things. You know, it's not like you can just go to the sheriff or you can call up the police. You're under occupation. They already don't like us anyway, and they've arrested Paul, and he's in a position of very frail situation. And Paul's sister's son heard of 40 Jews. You got 40 members of your family that are against you? Is it that bad? Or is it just one or two that'll mock you? That's what the king was dealing with. They will mock me. Do you have a whole group of individuals that plan on mocking you? That's a sexual term, by the way. In the Old Testament, this is something that they did to them. They cut their bottom of their pants off. It was something they did to shame them. They're going to mock me. You got anybody doing that for you? To you? You got anybody who's 40 different people that are so rabid that they're not eating or drinking because of Christianity if you were to become a Christian? That's what this situation was. Now, a moment ago I said that I also have these situations. You know what, brethren? Last week I spent 40 minutes on the phone with the president of Freed-Hardeman, the chancellor of Freed-Hardeman. And you know what? I'm wondering if I can be faithful. The stuff he told me, it's to our brotherhood, it's like Hiroshima. And one side of the brotherhood, this is what they'll say. If I expose it, Johnny always wanted to have his name in lights. He'll be the guy who taped the chancellor of Freed-Hardeman, and he said that he was running around with Pepperdine and Abilene Christian and all of these false teachers that we constantly been trying to get out of our midst, and he actually told me on tape. You know, when I got that, I went downstairs and told Micah, I said, you know, Micah, I wished I would have said it like this, Micah. Isaiah 6:1, I'm undone. But I said, I really don't have the capacity to even have this information, much less dispense it. I have no idea what to do with it. And the longer I go throughout the brotherhood and remain a preacher in our brotherhood, the more I realize, you know, most of the people that I know, preachers, they're not faithful. You know what they're doing? It depends on whether or not they're safe. If they're safe, a lot of times they'll talk big. And man, they'll write stuff in their papers and they'll name people. But let them get in a situation where it's going to cost them. And as we told you a couple of weeks ago, Jason Rollo made his first million this year, and he didn't have the courage to speak up. Nobody's paying him. He's got his own money. And he went to the Memphis School of Preaching and he didn't say a word. And, you know, I'm basically at the point wondering if I even belong in the brotherhood with any of those people. And you know what that means? Boy, that's a scary moment, y'all, where you just take a dive and you're no longer associated with any of these individuals. I don't know if I can be faithful. So we all really deal with the same thing. And the question this morning is, are you faithful? Do you realize that it could be that God is really, he needs one individual, and he needs you really badly to take a stand on his side to keep your entire family from going down the drain? You know, a couple of people in a family can destroy it. Just a couple of people who are on the devil's side, never really intending to, they can actually destroy an entire family. And one individual who takes a stand with God, the end of the story is they whisk Paul out of Jerusalem and to Damascus, and he ended up before Caesar. Can you imagine that boy, that young boy, Paul's sister's son, do you think that he thought, I'll go tell the captain and Uncle Paul will get to see Caesar? You think that's what he thought? See, that's what the devil tries to do. The devil tries to keep you from thinking anything like that. Oh, if I obey the gospel, well, I won't have any fun, and my friends will laugh at me, or I'll end up having all kinds of arguments and difficulties. When the real truth was, do what God said, and Uncle Paul will get to make his appeal in front of Caesar and get a house for 2 years paid for by the state and get to preach with no chains. Who would even imagine like that? Christians who are faithful. Individuals who actually trust in the power of God. They know that there is nothing. It's beyond our imaginations, Ephesians 3:20 says, more than we exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask and think. That's your imagination and that's your prayers. God can take you and your obedience and change your entire family, your entire home, the whole environment, and make it into just a peaceful, wonderful place when it was just a hotbed of trouble, frustration, and argument. Here's the question. Are you faithful? Do you have the faith that it takes to get the thing started? Obey the gospel, and then don't stagger. Just don't give up. Just keep chiseling away when you get behind and keep trying to be faithful. Are you here this morning and you're in that position where you've let things get to the point where you are questioning? Maybe God's looking at you and wondering, is she going to make it? Is he going to make it? Is he going to make a turn? Well, all the saints are praying that he will, that she will. And then you basically realize, look, I need to start chiseling back my way to being faithful. If you're here and that's the case, guess what? Every one of us have been like that. Every one of us will be like that again if we live past this week. And we're all praying and we're all hoping. If you're here this morning and you need us and you want God to have that visual of you, oh, he's coming back. She's coming back. She's going to be faithful. He's going to be faithful. He's going to obey. She's going to obey. You'll have God on your side. And your imagination isn't the limit of the things that God can do with you and for you if you'll simply have faith enough to obey. While we stand and sing.